grand finale of the day. We have the local star, of course, Professor Merav Ahissar, who's represented the ELSC and curious topic of sensitive sound statistics. Please, go ahead.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Ronnie and Danielle, for this stimulating and in a way surprising meeting for me, because I think I was mainly surprised by how stimulated I was by talks that are very different from seemingly different from what I do. And it was an amazing experience. Thank you for letting me be the very last speaker of this meeting. There's actually some good stuff in it. I feel like a closure in some ways, so my talk will be back to regularities, where it all, like 3 days ago, started. The regularities I'm studying are kind of simpler than the regularities with which the whole event started, which is regularities in actual music. I kind of reduce and reduce and reduce, and we get to the single frequency, pure tone frequencies, and how we learn them, and how we learn the irregularities. To some extent, some surprising people find it less interesting, but we use it as a way that allows us to, I think, understand mechanisms, underlying mechanisms, and sort of both quantify them, model them, and try to link across domains how things happen. And I think they represent something that is very general and characterizes not only simple stimuli, but also complex stimuli, and I will try to put them all together within a single framework. The point is that, as suggested across domains, well, across talks, we learn the environment, but somehow very little studies have dedicated themselves to understand how it is that we learn the environment. So it has these rules, it has these statistics, and we use predictions, and we talk about these predictions, but how do we acquire these predictions? How do we learn the environment? And in this talk, and to a large extent a focus of our lab studies in the last 3 or 4 years, I would divide this learning process to 2 time windows. Some that are kind of accumulative over a very long period. So it's kind of a hard acquired skills. One of these skills, for example, is language. We speak our native language and then acquire a second language. And we use lots of aspects of statistics that are acquired over long durations. And they have their characteristics that allow us to be fast and fluent speakers of our language. But some are important to adjust to very, very quickly because they depend on a very specific context at which we are at. So, for example, and these apply to all levels, to semantic levels, to specific levels, to the way I update my talk, given listeners' responses at all levels. And another sort of important aspect for understanding what I'd like to say, first, let's be on a touch base on what is perception, right? So it's been described a bit, but let's make it very, very clear. When I talk about perception, it's our immediate sense, your immediate experience of what I say, of whatever, what you see, but it's a high-level function. In what sense it's a high-level function? Perception doesn't happen in the eye. It is initiated by what happens in the eye, to an extent by what happens in the ear, and other senses I will not address, but it is the overall experience of the integration of our current sensory process, and all our relevant, sometimes perhaps irrelevant, long-term and short-term experiences. For example, I mean, this is an experience that we all have, the way people perceive la versus ra, or ba versus da, or th, se, all these things that I hear just the same. It's the same physical input, but we perceive something different. So we have the same sensation. Probably our ears don't differ, but we have a different experience, and it depends on our long-term and even short-term experiences because we can adjust to different accents, to different ongoing patterns. So altogether, this is our immediate perception. So it has the sensory aspect, and it has all these memory aspects. And I want to start with some examples, very few demos to get you the feel of what I want to say. And I will start with visual demos, but after one demo, I will get right into auditory stuff. The idea is that it works very, very similar. So I don't know who has seen this picture before. Typically, people's perception depends on whether they have experienced this visual, sensory stimulus before or not. So who can perceive, but don't say what you see, what some of you see and others will not? Nobody? Well, it tells a lot about who's the audience here. Okay. So who can perceive that now? This is a cow. It's not exactly the same stimulus, but it's a very clear stimulus. And the reason we can all clearly see a cow is because we're all cow experts, in a way. And the fact that we are all cow experts allow us to adjust our predictions to what a cow is very quickly, so that if we are now exposed to the same stimulus again, our perception is modified, even though our sensory experience had not been changed by this presentation, because I present you the first and the second again, and all I'm using is your long-term expertise and some recent adjustments so you can perceive something different. Well, it works across senses, and perhaps a stronger example is in the auditory modality, in speech perception, for example. I don't know how many of you perceive the clear sentence. It's kind of a messy version of this one. Oops, sorry. Why doesn't it work? Oh.
The man's painting a sign.
Have you perceived this one? Well, it depends whether you're a native English speaker or not.
The man's painting a sign.
Have you perceived this one? Now let's get back to the previous one and whether you can perceive it now. Okay? So it's the same stimulus. We all saw it's the same stimulus, but you had a recency account, a recency experience that modified your perception. In order for it to be really useful, you have to be a long-term expert in this kind of stimuli. For example, if I do the same thing, anybody perceive that? Let me give you a clear sample of this one. Well, now I'm expecting people to be either native Hebrew speaker and then perceive it very clearly, or not speak Hebrew and then, well, that's another thing. And the question is how it clarifies your previous one. Right, so you need some long-term expertise for this recency effect to kick in and form some coherent perception. So the idea is just to show you need some long-term experiences and short-term experiences that affect and update your prediction. I want to go beyond that. Okay, so we're actually working on that, but in a very parametric way. The task that we have been studying for quite a few years in the lab seems very simple. These are presumably two pure tones, very loud ones, I agree. But what you're asked to do, if you participate in a study in our lab, is tell which of these tones has a higher pitch. Now, the thing is that this task had been addressed as, well, it's a very simple task. It's a low-level auditory task because pitch is already, to an extent, already figured out, at least with simple stimuli, already in the ear. So presumably, it's a simple task. However, the way we perceive pitch, just like the way we perceive everything else, really depends on our experiences, on our long-term experiences, on our recent experiences, and this applies to this task as well. So by the time we are presented with the second tone, our understanding, our perceptual understanding of the pitch of the first tone really depends on what we then expected to perceive when it was first presented. The degree to which it depends on it depends on the overall noise with which we keep the first tone till the second tone is presented. But overall, we remember it or perceive and remember it more similar to the actual sound that we expected given previous tones. This sounds very strange, but let me give you a demo for that. This is a demo I took from, let's see. So you're asked to say which of the last two tones had a higher pitch. Typically, what you saw is what people have. So we had this is a borrowed demo, but there was a context effect, and there were the two tones, okay? And this was the perceived pitch. Now I'll present it, if I manage to, with a different context, the same two last tones, but you will perceive a different direction of pitch, hopefully. Okay? The same very last tones, what differs is the context which affected your prediction given the last two tones, okay? So even in this seemingly simple context matters a lot. And what I wanted to say so far, there's the accumulative context, which is all the stimuli that are similar, that you've heard throughout your life, in recent minutes, etc. And there's the very recent part, which is in a way the context effect. Things that happened in the very few last seconds, and they affect your overall percept of everything, including pitch. And what we are doing in the lab is using these two time constants to test how we learn it in a very simple way. Now, sorry for that. But these are very simple tones. These are pure tones. And in a very perplexing way, it helps us because given that they're so simple and pure tones, most people have not been exposed to similar stimuli before. Our environment is complex. So these are easy to simulate, but this is not people's experiences. And this means that we can control their overall experiences with these type of stimuli. So we can present them with all these frequencies of these tones and recent tones, etc. And then by their responses, track their learning of long-term and also recent effect of these speech stimuli and see what it tells us about how they accumulate information. Now, the way we specifically do it, I just want to give you a flavor of how we use this task actually as a window into our learning of the external statistics, in this case of frequency, of the stimuli that we are presenting. And this is kind of what's going on. So these are two tones, okay? This is the first tone, pam, pam, okay? This is higher. Now, the idea is that what happens is that with the retention, as the representation of this tone in our memory, in this case, perception and memory, really, they don't really differ that much. The representation gets closer to the mean, the one we expected. And in this case, because the representation gets closer to the mean by the time we hear the second tone, we tend to say that the second tone is higher because this gets closer to the mean. In this case, it will lead to a more accurate answer because the first tone was closer to the mean, the second tone was higher. So remembering the first tone is closer than it actually was makes the difference larger in the right direction. Are you with me? In the right direction, increasing our accuracy in this respect. However, if we have the same frequency difference, but this is a different order, so the second is closer, this is still contracted, perceived here as closer to the mean, and in this case, this is bad. So predictions are not always helpful. In this case, our prediction make it more similar to the expected one, but it was less similar than the expected one, so our replies will be less accurate. This gives us a very nice tool because we can compare the accuracy of this type of stimuli to the accuracy of these types of stimuli, and the difference, because the difficulty of the trial is the same, the difference is only a consequence of how you use the history, okay? So we have a measure of how to use history, but we also want to know how you used the very recent history versus the accumulative history, okay? So one thing is how they, how we represent the mean, how do we calculate the mean, and another thing is what happens with the more recent stimuli, okay? So more recent stimuli, somewhere around this area, but they could be either lower, these are the two tones, lower here, or could be higher, and what happens is the same process. So if we have this, we perceive it by the time that this tone is presented as lower, then why lower? With respect to the recent event, so it gets contracted to the recent frequency. In this case, frequency differences become smaller. An alternative is that the previous trial was just above it. In this case, we also contracted to the most recent trial. This is not the only contraction. This is the recency effect to the most recent trial. So this gets higher. And in this case, in this kind of trials, our accuracy will be improved, okay? Because, with respect to that one, okay? So what we can do is just compare same level of difficulties and measure the dependence on history and compare the dependence on the most recent event, previous one, second one, et cetera, and then use it as a window into how we learn the environment, okay? So just a reminder, so we have the recency, how we are affected by most recent events, and how we are affected by the global events. Why do I make this distinction? Why does it matter? Because actually, these two types of aspects, I'm making it binary just to make a clear claim, these two types of effects are important for different types of skills, right? If we want to know things that are generally there, they're generally more abundant, like, I don't know, syllables in the language, like words in the language, like letters, etc., that are long-term characteristics of being more frequent, we need to acquire global aspects along a very long time window. However, if I'm in a given situation, this is not enough, because I need to take into consideration the specific context. Taking into consideration the specific context requires accommodating the most recent effects. So if I have a difficulty in accommodating the most recent effects, I have a difficulty in updating to a given context. Okay? If I have a difficulty in accumulating rich information, I may have a difficulty in being in a good position of rich language abilities. Okay? And this is kind of a theoretical prediction that we can test. So we can, as I said, we can calculate the relative contribution in your decision. We're all in the same two-tone, but forget now the two-tone. What we can use it for is look at how previous information affected your judgments. This is the most recent event, one before, and these are all others. So it's the fourth, fifth, sixth, and all others that I presented in the task that I tested you with, okay? So most recent event per item has the largest effect. Is that good? Well, it depends. You know, if the environment never changes, it's exactly the same environment, there's no benefit in using the very last event with a larger magnitude, because you just want to accumulate information. Every time window has some information. But how do we know that? I mean, things change slightly, but we don't know if they change because the statistics change or because there's overall variability. So this is what happens in the general population. One could call it a duplex learning system. We give a lot of weight to the most recent event, which is good. We update. Sometimes there's no need, but we don't have to change, and we actually cannot change. This is what we do, even if the environment doesn't change at all. This is always what we do. We give more weight to the most recent events. On the other hand, we also accumulate information across longer time window, and it allows us to create rich prototypes, rich representations, etc., etc. Okay? And now the question I'm aiming, and this is why I'm here in this last session, is this the pattern that characterizes different populations across individuals? To what extent different people have the same pattern? So we studied two populations for quite a long time, actually, until we reached these results. First is developmental dyslexia. So we are talking about individuals who generally cope very well in cognitively demanding situations, but their skills, their linguistic skills, and particularly their reading skills, are not as proficient. They never become real expert in things they have a lot of experience with, okay? You may hopefully have some prediction into what I'm about to show you, which is our results. And this is the pattern of dyslexics and how they learn in this task. So they're learning from the most recent one, they're updating. Most recent event is just as control. Blue is control, good readers. Dyslexics are matched for age, for other general reasoning abilities, but not for reading. So the recent effects are very similar, but the effects of earlier events are smaller. Our interpretation is that they have a faster decay of their acquired memory, and hence their long-term acquisition does not work as efficiently, even though their fast online sensation and integration of very recent events does not differ from controls, okay? This is a very specific, I mean, it has broad effects, but it's a kind of specific, not sensory event, but pattern of perceptual learning. Is this pattern really relevant to other skills? I mean, I'm showing it in a two-tone, and really, even though I'm fascinated by two-tone discrimination, I've been studying it for many years, I'm aware of the fact that some people are not as fascinated as I am, and individuals with dyslexia are more worried about their reading difficulties than about the effects of their two-tone discrimination. So is it relevant, okay? So we kind of mapped the two-tone discrimination to a reading context, and this is Sagi's work, part of Sagi's PhD, and we gave them sort of very quickly non-words. This is Hebrew written, so it would be say, midka, lusko, midka, oops. It's a repetition. The second time they read this word, they read it faster, okay? Now we measure how faster it is in the second time. And then they continue, and then they, I don't know if you remember, but lusko, which is this one, is a repetition of something that had been before, but with a larger interval. So there's also a benefit, but because the interval is larger, there's some forgetting, and the question is whether the forgetting of the dyslexic individuals with dyslexia will be larger because there's some kind of effective leakage of their memory. And this is exactly what we find. If you look at this kind of repetition with less than 5 seconds interval, the benefit is rather large. I mean, in terms of milliseconds, 150 milliseconds, this is kind of how much you benefit from a repetition, a repeated word. However, if you have a longer interval, the individuals with dyslexia lose more of their relative benefit. Okay. This yields, by the way, what is very trivial in one way, but non-intuitive in other ways, a prediction. The prediction means that if you have some, like the case of dyslexia, some faster decay of memory, then if you look at what performance will look like as a function of practice, okay, exposure, and well, people improve with practice, okay? The interesting point we are not really aware of is that our learning with practice never saturates. We can have these easy tasks that we can do 100% correct, but if we have sufficiently sensitive tasks, we never saturate. For example, I read a lot in English, but I'm not a fast reader in English. I have lots of experience, but it doesn't look like my native language when I read. If I want to read fast, it has to be in Hebrew. There's still a big difference because I keep improving, and it doesn't saturate. This means that if we look at the relative difficulty of individuals with dyslexia compared with controls after lots of practice versus little practice, the group difference is expected to increase. It sounds non-intuitive because everybody improves with practice, but because the slope of improvement is shallower, we predict that they will improve to a lesser extent. This is something we can test. Okay? Now, we cannot go, it's very difficult to track people for years and years, but what we can do is compare performance of the same individuals to frequent items in their language versus non-frequent items, okay? So, for example, here we did, this is Eva's work, she studies span. What is a span? How many items can you remember if I just test you? For example, let's do, active participants makes you more alert, as we have noticed. So let's do the span task in English. Okay, are you ready? So I will give you a series of digits, and then you will have to repeat them as accurately as you can. 4, 9, 2, 7, 3, 5, 1, 8. Voila. Right. So that one thing I can tell you is that, on the average, people whose first language is Hebrew will have a shorter span than people whose first language is English. Because even though we're all Israelis experienced with digits, it does not saturate. So people, I didn't burden you with this one, but we tested it. People who are not dyslexics, who are good speakers of English as a second language, they never acquire the same span as native speakers. And luckily, span, so this is the control, the span in English, and this is the span, well, the score for this test in Hebrew, and Hebrew scores are higher, okay? This makes sense. This is what happens with the individuals with dyslexia. So the difference between performance in English, which is, in Hebrew, is really large, and the difference between performance in English is small, as we predicted. So it's not that the individuals with dyslexia are great English speakers, But if you look for real expertise, they do not reach expertise in Hebrew, even though they have massive experience because of this graph, and this applies to other stuff as well. Basically, what we think is that the expert has gradually developed a very rich representation, and if you don't develop as rich representation, then even though you have lots of exposure, you lack some of the expert's properties that allow you to be a fast reader, that allow you to use lots of other stuff more automatically, etc. Second population I want to address is individuals with autism. Now, when I talk about individuals with autism, I mean the specific population that we studied that are now diagnosed as individuals on the autism spectrum, but we're specifically referring to individuals who were previously diagnosed as having Asperger. What does it mean that you have an Asperger? You have communication difficulties, but you don't have any language difficulties. You're doing okay in aspects that are not associated with social aspects, which limits a lot of the non-academic parts, but academically you can do very well. So first, they don't have a language difficulty, and their reading of single words is just like controls. This is not the case for paragraphs, and I will address it in a minute. So what is the problem in autism? Autism is kind of, there's lots of theories on autism. Here is ours. We think it explains everything. And I will try to convince you in 10 minutes why we think so and what is the case for it. First, this is the most important thing, that in the context of this talk, we tested individuals with autism on exactly the same task, and we looked at how they learn based on the history within our assessment. So long-term effects do not differ from controls. What differ from controls is the impact of the most recent events. Most recent events do not affect their predictions to a large extent. This means that they do not update the perceptual predictions sufficiently fast, because within a time window of 2-3 seconds, they do not change their predictions based on recent events. Now, we tested it in a completely non-social context, but we think that in a social context, it would be extremely crucial. Because in a social context, if you come with plans of what you're going to say, and people respond not verbally, just by their gestures, by their intonation, as, wait a minute, I don't understand, or I'm bored or something, you have to update your pre-planned program as to what you're about to say. And if you have to update and you do not do that, you're kind of very rigid in your performance because you are consistent with the things that you plan to say or plan to be communicating about before you did. And it really can be a huge obstacle for active social interaction. So just to sum up in terms of the visualization, we find the same task but just opposite type of characteristics. Difficulty in updating recent events versus difficulty in retaining long-term representations, and they're very well mirrored by the type of difficulties that people have. Sort of individuals with dyslexia have difficulties in reading single words and have difficulty in reading a paragraph. We believe that their difficulty in reading a paragraph is because they don't benefit for the fluency of the long-term effects. Individuals with autism also have difficulties in reading a paragraph, even though they're fluent with the sort of long-term effects, because in a paragraph you have to utilize online the specific order of the words that has a meaning, and it was not there, you're not familiar with the sentence. If it's a sentence you're familiar with, you're not expected to have longer delays compared with controls. Can we say something about underlying brain mechanisms? Again, I feel it's a closure with the first day because, you know, Ellie Nelken and Leon Duell, we are studying related stuff, and I studied in this context. And I agree with what was suggested, that cortical adaptation, what Ellie termed, for those who were here, stimulus-specific adaptation, namely the pattern that if you present the same stimulus again with a short interval, you tend to have a smaller brain response. What does it mean that you have a smaller brain response to the specific stimulus, stimulus-specific adaptation? That there's some memory that this stimulus had been recently presented, because otherwise you would have had the same magnitude of response. So if there's some memory, you respond smaller. For how long does this memory last? How long does it take it to evolve? So if it's a short interval, like half a second, typically individuals in the auditory system have a smaller response. If the interval is 2 seconds, it's still a smaller response. If the interval is 10 seconds, then the response gets to its initial level. So this time window, this level of adaptation has a time window of about 10 seconds. Now, if this is the case, that stimulus-specific adaptation differs in these three populations, neurotypicals, individuals with dyslexia, individuals with autism, we have a specific prediction in terms of the time window of adaptation. Individuals with dyslexia are expected to have, sorry, I'm giving you a few seconds to think about it. What are they expected to have? So if they have leakage of memory, right, so they forget faster, so the window of adaptation is expected to be shorter, right? It's they're expected to have a large response back again after a shorter time window. Individuals with autism are expected to have the opposite response. With a short interval, they will not have an adaptation yet. So if you have a half a second, they're not expected to have a smaller response. However, even with large interval, the small response is expected to be retained. So slower to kick in, but lasts longer. These are the predictions, and this is, not surprisingly, what I'm going to present. It's a complex one. I thought I'm presenting it gradually. Apparently, I'm not. So let me just take you through the essence of what I want you to see. The essence of what I want you to see, this is the N1P2. N1P2 auditory cortex. Then we have a second tone, pum, pum, okay? N1P2 of the second tone. Note that the response to the second tone is adapted. It's smaller. It's expected to be smaller. It's, in this case, about less than a second after the first tone. It is smaller here. It is another control. It is smaller in the case of dyslexia. It does not happen in the case of autism. In the case of autism, the second response with a short interval is actually not smaller than the first response. You don't see adaptation. Now we do the same kind of assessment with 2 seconds, 4 seconds, 6 seconds, or 10 seconds, and we look at how long it takes you to get to the largest response. In control, it indeed reaches, it's hard to follow, but anyhow, this is the 10-second interval, and it reaches the peak in 10 seconds. If you look at the dyslexia population, it reaches the peak faster. This is 1.5, 3 seconds. By 6 seconds, they reach the peak. Namely, they forget that a recent stimulus, the same characteristic had been presented. What happens with autism? They don't. Their adaptation remains even when there's a 10-second interval, as if they are with the same stimuli, they are with the same pattern that they have been presented, and it has advantages and it has drawbacks. It has advantages. They are good in retention. It has a drawback because they're slow in updating if things change, okay? If there's a local noise, they could be resilient to it, but they will update slower. Last point I want to show is, does this really generalize to another task? What we're saying is that there's a general slow update versus, let's say, slow update in autism. If there's a general slow update, then we expect them to also be slow in updating their motor plan. When do you really have to update quickly with your motor plan? Now. This is Nori. Nori's demo went off. Let's do it again. Let's see if it works. No, I need to do it again. Oh, sorry. I know, it stopped in the middle. Tap with it. Okay, this is it. So Nori since then has moved to slightly more complex patterns of tapping, but actually this tells you a lot. You've all noticed that the tempo changed, right? And the question is, how quick are you in updating to the tempo change? Well, it depends on what population you are. Okay, so this is the interval, this is the finger tap, typical, the interval becomes longer, and the question is what happens? And this is what happens with individuals with autism. This is the metronome, okay? It has this tempo, and then it changes. In this case, it becomes a longer interval, and this is the opposite. From longer interval, it becomes shorter interval, okay? This is what happens with the general population in blue. It takes them 2 taps to reach the actual updated rate of tapping. And this is what happens with the individuals with autism. They kind of lag behind when tempo changes. So they do not manage to update also their motor program when things change. And the time scale we're talking about is half a second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, and they do not manage to change their motor program. We can sort of model, and I will not get to the details, we can model this paradigm, perfect. We can model this paradigm and try to dissociate. Is it really motor noise? Because in a motor protocol, you have to press. Is it about the problem with the pressing? Is it about the difficulty? So this is motor noise. This is control. In this case, we also had a group of individuals with dyslexia performing the same task. None of the groups differs in their general motor noise. There's no difference. Every symbol denotes a single person. The other parameter in the model is timekeeping. So if you need to press with a given interval, you need to have some internal representation of this interval. Do they have a problem in keeping this accurate or this representation in a non-noisy manner? No. There's no difference between populations in keeping the fixed tempo. But when you have to correct the phase, when you have to update and change what you have done before, the individuals with dyslexia are not affected. Their time window is not interrupted within this small window, half a second, 2 seconds. They do it just like controls. However, the individuals with autism have a difficulty in updating this phase. So it's a sensory motor task. You have to update motor plan in this kind of time window, and they're not as efficient as controls. Interestingly, even though we reach this result from a purely, in a way, computational view, without the social context, just calculating how people perform tasks that have no relevance for social interactions. You're in front of a computer, you're in front of a metronome. The only people that had a similar idea are clinicians. In a very interesting way, we kind of, when we tell these things to clinicians, say, right, of course. But people who have studied sort of in a more systematic way had alternative accounts that I will not go into, unless asked. No, I will not go into, but this is kind of stuff that we found among clinicians. For example, Bruno Gebstein, and he has like autism, a world changing too fast for slow wide brain, etc. And interestingly, they have been manipulating like visual presentations. And if you slow down visual videos, it turns out that also the pattern of eye movements of individuals with autism look much more like that of individuals with no autism. So they have manipulated these kind of things from a clinical perspective, like trying to see what might help. And these are the things that effectively help. And here I reached the summary. So what I wanted to say is that differences in the dynamics of learning, the environment statistics, can explain individuals' general tendencies. So we are studying low-level tasks, presumably low-level, but we're actually using them as a window into how you learn the environment. Because they're simple, we can calculate them, we can model them, and we can understand. And it seems to be the case that it's not specific to the modality we're asking. And from this perspective, it means that reduced retention, which is what we find for individuals with dyslexia, it is consistent with the difficulties they have because it impedes the accumulation of rich long-term prototypes. I've shown you how the representations of digits in Hebrew are not as solid. We've done this with frequent syllables versus infrequent syllables, etc. So they have specific difficulties with things that are more frequent in the language, but it has strengths as well. So, for example, actually, when you think about it, there is a balance between how you're affected by the long-term experiences. It has benefits because you have good expertise. But if you need to do changes, maybe it's a good thing that you're not, subject to all these long-term experiences and you're more able to be an entrepreneur in a lot of aspects. And actually, this is kind of and informal characteristics of some individuals with dyslexia that get what's going and are not as affected by long-term experiences, whereas the complementary seems to be the case for individuals with autism. So the rate of online updating is low. They're not good for online interactions, social interactions, sensory motor interactions, and this is also one of the characteristics about individuals with Asperger. They have difficulties in some kind of, even in driving cars, etc., that are sensory motor, and we think it comes from the same basic limitation. But it also comes with a strength, because they are very reliable in accumulating rich information. It is apparent in their tendencies, in their hobbies. They have these specific hobbies that are associated with lots of information that needs no fast updating. These are kind of, some of them seem weird to us because this is not a strength of most of the typical population, because we kind of play with the balance of updating. Also, we predict, even though we haven't tested it, that they will be more resilient to local noises that are not repeated because they're only here and they will not affect their long-time statistics. So what we actually suggest, this is last slide, is in terms of other translational, because this is like the session, right? Other translational implications, because we are kind of a basic research lab, but other translational implications. Yes, the brain is plastic. I certainly resonate with that. But the problem is the training effects are quite specific. And this is my other hat in terms of the lab. Do training things generalize? And I was curious about the questions that were presented to you, to what extent you generalize. Well, we are good in learning, even if we are suffering for all sorts of difficulties. We're still good in learning, but we learn what we are taught. This is very difficult across domains, in school, in whatever. And for me, it means that what we need to change is not the individuals who have a different learning pattern. We need to understand different learning patterns. We need to understand their strengths, and also to adapt many of the relevant situations to the things that are easier for them and the things that are more difficult for them. And I think it resonates with lots of people that work with autism. It's not, and also with dyslexia. I think I gave a talk where most individuals in the audience were dyslexics, and I told them all the things that I'd say are wrong with them. And they said, but we want you to tell us why it's wonderful to be an individual with dyslexia. And I think it took me several years to understand that we don't need to make everybody the same, and it is not obvious that what we want to say is, okay, so how can we put everybody to the same? No, we want to understand, and we have the means in many, many of our situations to personalize the environment within which we teach individuals according to their strengths and weaknesses and help them strive with the unique characteristics. Thank you. And
thank you so much, Professor Ahissar. Questions? Start from the middle and work our way back to Ronnie.
Okay, thank you. What about aging adults? We know that they have...
in general population?
Yes, we know they have difficulties in speech perception, not accounted by hearing difficulties. So there are the theories of temporal processing, the theories of working memory. Do they also have, are these difficulties can be related to the difficulty in updating that is age-related?
It's a great question. I think of myself as an evidence-based person. I have no evidence either way, so I have difficulties in answering. But in terms of, so I don't know what their pattern would be. We didn't test it. I would think that there is a, my best guess is that everything, after having said that I shouldn't answer, I'm answering. So I think they would be lower in both, so that they have a fast decay and a slow update, and like everything would be. And in terms of sort of translational, I would think I wouldn't try to generally improve memory losses, for example, I would try to refresh the relevant things that that are important for people to remember on some kind of interval base, rather than say, oh, I can improve the general memory skills. If it's important to remember a set of people, go through this set of people in the morning in a custom-tailored kind of application that will use the stimuli that are important for you, and you will be doing better with these specific stimuli.
And the complementary question is, what about the other side of the spectrum, developmental children? How these abilities develop with age?
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I have some, but it's even more speculative. But actually, launching some kind of longitudinal study, but we're launching longitudinal study, yeah.
Okay, moving on to, well, let's get a question from Ronnie. And we have about 4 minutes for the discussion because we need to prepare for the concert.
Is there anyone else who wants to?
Ronnie, the questions relate to me or?
No.
I'm done.
You're done. I thank Merav for willing to be the last speaker in a 3-long-day conference. So give her a big clap. Thank you. So we have 4 minutes before we have to leave the hall in order